is that we continue to stay relevant. And, there's often a discussion in various courses about whether coaching is just a fad, whether it's just a gimmick, is it here to stay, does it provide anything that's lasting? I think that to answer that question about how coaching stays of value in the world means that we continually have to ask ourselves the question about what is the purpose of coaching? What is the relevance of coaching? And one way to begin to take a look at that for me is to explore the history of, how come coaching emerged at this time in human history? So, I think we can say that new practices emerge to take care of concerns that existing practices can no longer address. Because, we've had many different ways of working with people over the last 100 years or so, consulting, mentoring, teaching, training, etc., etc. And now in the last 40 years or so, depending on where you see the start of coaching, but certainly within the last 30 or 40 years, this new profession called coaching has arisen. And I think part of what it has arisen for is that there are questions that we human beings are grappling with that are more than just about how do we have a more comfortable life or how do we achieve our goals, but much more about, how do we navigate this very uncertain world? How do we navigate a world filled with inequality or political in all parts of the globe, really, environmental issues, etc. And I think one of the things that I would say, particularly since the end of the Second World War, is that we've lived in a time where the kind of answer to everything, every question has been progress will take care of it or technology will take care of it. And, to be bold, I don't think that's enough of an answer. We're not just about getting more stuff or making technological progress. There are real deep human questions about how we live in the world that we live today that I think coaching is beginning to address. And I think they are much more about questions about meaning and purpose, but also questions about, what kind of world have we created? What kind of world has our addiction to growth and technological progress caused us? And it's that I think is at the heart of this work. And I think for coaching to be relevant, there's a sort of slight paradox really for me, which is that coaching is part of the world, but we also need to stand outside or stand separate and say, how are you moving or what's going on here? So we're asking almost outsider questions in the sense that we don't just necessarily go along with the status quo and say, well, the answer is more this or progress this or technology that, but actually ask questions about how we put the world together. How is it possible that we in the 21st century live in a world where we still think it's okay that more than half the world's population are suffering economically or, crimes against humanity, injustice, unfairness? How is it that we are still at risk of, creating environmental destruction without asking questions? And, often when we ask those questions as an insider, we just look for more of the same as our answers. And I think coaching has part of the function of being an outsider to the world to say, let's take a look at how we're doing this. Let's take a look at what's really going on and ask some deep questions about the system and the way we put it together that is more than just, if you like, finding solutions. And, if I think about what I'd like to open up, and I'm going to ask people to join in a moment, whether that's by chat or actually participating by speaking, depending on how the technology allows us to do. What I'd like to take a look at is, this idea that coaching is about... Hello? Sorry, I wasn't sure someone was calling me. This profession for me is more than just about helping people take actions and set goals. It's about looking at deeper questions around how we live in the world, both in terms of, as I said, asking questions about the system, but also that I don't think coaching is like a sort of, pill or panacea for the world, that if we have coaching, everything will be fine. Life has its challenges, particularly now in the world in which we live, but generally speaking, life has its challenges. And I think coaching sits not as a fix, but as helping us to live in the world more harmoniously with each other, more harmoniously with ourselves, and perhaps, with a word that I think is very much contemporary at the moment, with some degree of resilience to navigate all of the uncertainties. So what I'd like to do now, if it's okay, is to open this up a little bit. What thoughts or questions or experiences are you having as I begin to outline some of the territory of what I think around this profession and this question of the relevance of it? So I'll be very curious to hear or read your thoughts or questions about that so that we can actually move into more of a conversation.
Hi, good morning. This is Renee Petzer.
Hello, Renee. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for that thought provocation. I think as coaches in Nigeria, what we really can do is just take the questions that have been asked and kind of go, well, what does this mean in Nigeria? What kind of world have we created in Nigeria? What do people here strive for? What has been okay for us to accept here? And what does that mean for us as coaches? Because we live in quite an extreme part of the world, where there is, for instance, extreme poverty and extreme violence and extreme corruption. And as humans and as coaches, we get desensitized to that because it's so much around us. And so I think the question for us as a chapter to ask is really, what does it mean for us here locally?
Yeah, and thank you for that, Renee. I think I'd say a couple of things in response to that. I get that, of course, every area has its particular challenges, and some challenges more extreme than others, as you point to. And at the same time, I think there's a question for us as a coaching profession, which is, how do we exist within the culture that we exist? Because, I'm not separate from the culture of the country in which I live, or the world, or the systems in which I operate. I'm part of them. I'm affected by them in the same way as every citizen is. And, one of the questions I sometimes find myself asking the profession when I speak at chapters and things is coaching part of the solution, or is it part of the problem? And I think the simple answer to that question, and I don't think there is really something that you can say very quickly about it, but I would say it's a little bit of both. We contribute to the way things are, and we also challenge it. And that's not an easy place to sit, but I don't think I would say that coaching is the solution just by itself, or that coaching is only a force for good in this world. And the reason why I say that, and I've been in this profession for 20 years, so I care deeply about the profession, so this isn't an anti-coaching statement, but the reason why I say that is that if we don't take a look at how we as human beings, before we even think of ourselves as coaches, if we don't take a look at how we as human beings are enmeshed in the world and the way that it is. So I don't know Nigeria very well at all, apart from what I read occasionally in the news. So I'm not speaking like an expert or someone who has the local knowledge that you do, Renee, and all of the people on this webinar. But if I take a look at the system in the country in which I live and the world in which I live, I live in Britain, and we're not an island. Well, we are an island, but we're not an island in the sense that we interact with the world. I'm part of that, and I think one of the things I've seen as a danger in the coaching profession in Britain and the US and South Africa and Singapore, which are the main places in which I've worked, is something around this thing of almost that we coaches are different. And I think that's only part of the answer, is that we are, as I say, challenging the status quo, or asking questions of systems, but we're also part of that system. So how did we as human beings put this world together? And part of why I say that is that I think there's something for me about beginning to see that part of the challenge we have in the world is a sense of us and them, whether it's, the left against the right, the south against the north, these different perspectives in which we hold each other. And then that allows us to not see ourselves as being intimately connected with the way that the world is. So I don't know if that really answers your question, Renee, but that's what comes to mind when I hear you speaking about, the questions that coaches must ask themselves. It's, if you like, we could put it in a different way, going back to something I said a little bit earlier, which is, how are we coaches part of the way that the world is? Because we often think about us as being a force for good, which I don't disagree with, but also we must ask ourselves the question, how are we part of the way the world is? Because I think if we don't do that, then we're in danger of falling into the with us or against us binary thinking that, in my judgment, and of course this is only my perspective, it's not like I'm speaking the truth, but in my judgment, that with us or against us binary thinking has created a lot of the problems that we have, has led to things like extreme poverty and extreme violence that you speak about, or extreme injustice in the world, or the geopolitical and environmental problems that we face.
Thanks. It does, and I think it puts it raises some wonderful questions for discussion for us here locally. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think thank you for the acknowledgement there, Renee. I think this is the thing: is that, you know, if you like, my primary care around the profession is that we don't stop asking those questions, and sometimes they're very uncomfortable questions, but ask them, I believe we must. So I hope that, you know, part of what I hope I'm doing is sowing some seeds for some questions to reflect on. What other thoughts are cooking as people are listening to this, you know, to listen to what I'm saying, listening to Renee's input? What are you experiencing or reflecting on as we go into this?
Hello, Aboodi. This is Ade.
Hi, Ade.
Adeboye Martin.
Hello.
Ade, please go ahead.
It's from Nigeria as well. Latent in what you've said, there's a reciprocal. Sorry? Hello?
Hello.
Somebody said something? Yeah? Do you hear me?
Yes, I can
Yeah,
hear you.
okay. Man influences his environment, and his environment reciprocally influences him. So there's a kind of continuous loop between man and his environment.
Yeah.
Now, the coach can play, because the coach is one of the managers within certain spheres of life of, let me not say manager, he's a facilitator. He, she can be a facilitator of human self-awareness. Mm-hmm. Of how people see themselves and their place in the world. Mm. At least he contributes continually to that awareness. So I think that the coach has a powerful role to play there, can be a force for good. In Nigeria, we have, as we know, a very challenging environment, but we can't just say the environment is challenging. We are a part of the environment. The environment is a reflection of our collective self-awareness, so to speak. So the coach plays a role beyond the achievement of immediate goals, beyond helping people find out what is satisfactory for them in their own lives and achieving those things. Beyond that, he can help people come to a better awareness of their impact on the environment. In challenging environments, it's often that we come across the attitude that it's the environment, it's the system, it's them, it's not us, you know, and everybody's putting the responsibility for the state of affairs on everybody else. I think that in his work, in her work, a coach can help people become aware of the impact that they have on their environment. And help people learn to take voluntarily more responsibility.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, Ade, and I think there's something that I'd like to just expand on that, which ties in a little bit with what I was saying with Renee earlier, which is I agree with you, and I think it's very easy for us humans to externalize blame onto circumstances. And at the same time, and this is part of, I think, what's challenging for us, is to acknowledge that to go back to your reciprocal loop, we are shaped by the environment. And it's not really about blaming the environment. I suppose it's more about acknowledging that if we live, for instance, in a very extreme circumstance of extreme poverty or extreme violence, or we're in a community or a group of people that is being heavily discriminated against or oppressed by a system, that it's often the case that people might feel like they have no possibilities for themselves. And one of the things that I notice when I work with coaches is that it's very difficult for us as coaches to acknowledge the legitimacy of a coachee saying that she or he has no choice about their circumstances. Now, please, I don't want to say that it's true that someone has no choice, but if somebody experiences that they have no choice, part of the challenge for us as coaches is how do we legitimize that is a true statement from the way in which the coachee sees her world or his world. And that really connects for me with this idea that we are part of the world. So I'm not separate from the world or separate from the suffering of the world. Britain doesn't have the same challenges as Nigeria, but, there are challenges in Britain, and I read the news and I have my concerns and I have my fears and my anxieties, and I blame the government or I blame something else. This is part of being human, and I think a challenge in the profession, although we are absolutely... hear that. Oh, thanks, it's gone. What I was saying is that although you're right in the sense that we are not just victims of the environment, we also acknowledge that we are shaped by it. And how do we navigate that? Partly as ourselves, part of what you were saying about helping clients become more self-aware, I absolutely agree with that, of course. But of course, part of that journey is how do we as coaches become more self-aware? How do I come to the world shaped by it and work with my own sense of being a victim sometimes when I read the news or see a direction that the world is going in that causes me despair or heartbreak? My parents are from Iraq, and, in the last 15 years, of course, I've watched that country being destroyed, and I've had plenty of experiences of feeling very angry with the world and blaming people and this and that. And, I don't think that that's necessarily helpful for me, but when I speak to my coach, I want to feel that perspective is not wrong. And I'm not sure that I'm pretty sure that you weren't saying this, Ade, but one of the things I've heard British coaches and American coaches do is to try and move people away from that place where they say the system has done this, or I'm too poor to make a difference, etc., rather than acknowledging that this is true for the person saying it in that moment. And I think this is really important, because only then do we have the capacity to reach people, is when we say, I fully support and understand the way in which you see the world as being true for you. And it's not like it's wrong or it's right. If you feel, for instance, that you have no choices in life, as a coach, I can best serve you, not by saying everybody has a choice, what are the choices, or there must be some choices, but actually more to explore with you, how come you see that you have no choices in life? And I think part of what that allows us to do is work with individuals, but it also allows us to look more globally at the world. Sorry, something just flashed up on my screen from the coaching chapter, and I wondered if it was related to me, but it isn't. It's just a spreadsheet that's popped up for some reason. So I apologize for that moment of distraction. But I think, when I look at the world today, I often see this thing around responsibility being used almost to say to people or countries who've experienced challenging times or been at the receiving end of some oppression of one kind or another, whether that's poverty or racial inequality, and then say to those people who've experienced that, well, you just have to get over it or move forward, rather than acknowledging that we've all been shaped by the experiences that we've had. And if a group of people or an individual has experienced prejudice or discrimination or oppression, that is going to shape them. And I think this is really challenging territory for the coaching profession. As I said, I'm not familiar really with the Nigerian coaching community at all, but I've worked in many countries, and I see this as almost, if you like, one of the blind spots of the profession, is how do we reach people who feel and live as if they don't have any say in what happens to them. And that is really accompanies often that experience of having been a victim of something, whether that, as I say, is oppression or natural disaster or extreme poverty. And, when we acknowledge our own experience of having suffered in the world or felt powerless or troubled, then I think it gives us a place in which to stand to reach out and support others. And again, this isn't about providing solutions. It's about providing a sense of meeting someone where she or he is, and then taking a look together at what might be some ways forward. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, your point, Ade, but for me, it's a very important part about what coaching is about and how we stay relevant, is to really acknowledge where people are at, whether that, as I say, is individuals or countries or groups of people.
Hello, Aboodi. Sorry, I lost you for quite a while, but I'm back. And I think I've got I think I've got a gist of what you said, and I agree totally with you. It's not. Even though the words responsibility and blame are kind of similar in general usage, I think there's a deep difference between them. I think responsibility empowers, while blame usually does the opposite. And I agree with you. You can't come and preach at your clients, not being a preacher, of course, and tell them, no, you're wrong. You have the power, and so on and so forth. But rather, you enter their model of the world and sense and sympathize with their feeling of limitation, and then begin, having gained some real contact with them, begin to help them develop a wider vision of possibilities.
Yeah.
So I agree totally with you there. And I think that sometimes if a coach is not fully aware of his responsibility, he can begin to think of himself as a preacher and slip into that role.
Yeah, I think this is a real. Sorry, Ade. I think this is a real challenge.
It's our task to be so aware.
I'll take the thing, so I'm losing.
I can hear you.
Okay, so yeah, I was just saying that I think that this is, a real challenge for the profession is to not fall into the trap of becoming a preacher. And certainly what I've seen in Britain and the US, particularly those two territories, is that coaching really often falls into that trap of preaching to people. And, part of this, remember, is also about the narratives in which we live. So the narrative in the US is very much about you make your own luck, anyone can be a millionaire, etc. And, this is partly what I meant when I was speaking earlier about being on the questioning the way we put the world together, being on the outside of that to some extent. If we live inside a narrative that says you make your own luck, anyone can be a millionaire, anyone can be president, then it's very hard inside that narrative to meet somebody who says, I feel powerless, or I can't achieve this, or I have no choices. It's very hard to give them any legitimacy because it doesn't make sense inside the world in which that person is operating. So partly as coaches, we have to be always curious about what is the narrative in which we live? What is the narrative in which the coachee lives? As you said, going into their world, but also exploring our world. What are the assumptions that I've grown up with? What are the assumptions of my culture, of my country, of the system in which I work, the organization in which I work, for instance? Different companies have different stories about the world, have different values. As I said, my parents came from the Middle East, where, I know they say in many parts of Nigeria as well, the Arabic phrase, inshallah, which means if God wills it. And when my parents or, other people from the Middle East make arrangements or do anything in life, of course, it's always with inshallah. It's kind of partly in God's hands. That's very different to the American narrative of you make your own luck. And that shapes something. And I, remember growing up as a child and, living inside my parents' house, which was, they were Arabic and spoke Arabic a lot of the time. And then going out into the more kind of, normal, everyday class of my life, which was very English, and seeing these two worlds kind of interact with each other and recognizing quite young that these things shape us very profoundly. And when I work across cultures, I'm always curious about what is the message of the culture, particularly around this question of responsibility and choice. If you live in a narrative that has inshallah as its driving force, or a sense of surrendering to God and putting things in God's hand, it's very different than, I am in charge of my destiny. And that shapes not just individuals, but shapes whole cultures. So we have to be really curious about that. And of course, it's not just about culture and religion. It's also the families that we grew up in, the stories we grew up in. And we're coaching somebody. Part of what I want to do, which ties to your point, Ade, is what is their world? Tell me about your world. Really good coaching conversation for me has to include something about tell me the world that you see. What is your story? Then you work. And reiterate what we were saying, I think the danger for the profession is that we often, particularly, and as I say in Britain and the US, don't do that bit. We just go, everybody has a choice, you make your own luck, what could you do to make today great? All those kinds of questions, which aren't bad questions in themselves, but if we don't meet and understand the world of the coachee and the world in which she or he lives and operates, then we miss the opportunity to really be of service. And I think this is critical, particularly in challenging times, because we have to acknowledge people's experience of what challenge and challenging times does to them. So I love what you're opening up today. Thank you. Who else?
I'd just like to say,
yes.
Thank you very much for your comment. And I think you've given us something that we might be able to do if others agree. Get together and discuss and try and sort of become aware of what are the surrounding narratives that our coaches, that influence our coaches unconsciously, even consciously.
Yeah.
I think that would help us a lot as coaches. Thanks.
Yeah, no, you're welcome, Ade. And just to pick up on that point, to say one more thing, that thing about the unconscious narratives, I grew up, I said my parents were from Iraq. My father was also Jewish. Iraq in the 1950s was complicated, to say the least. And I remember as a young person in Britain, he would say to me, the world is dangerous, be very careful when you speak about this. And I'd say, this doesn't make sense. I live in England, people can say what they like, etc. But of course, my father grew up in a culture where the Jews had to keep a little bit quiet, and sometimes they'd be allowed to speak and sometimes they wouldn't, and they were oppressed and things. He grew up in a narrative of and being careful, and then there were military dictatorships in Iraq, which I know you've had in Nigeria as well. Well, that shapes people and shapes the things that are possible. So it's a lovely inquiry to be in. And I think, when I work with coaches, and I often lead programs with coaches from many different countries, this is one of the questions that we really get into, is what shapes the narratives of the world of the people we work with, but also what shapes our narratives, because again, we're part of this too. And I grew up in this kind of narrative, which shapes me as this kind of coach, but it might blind me to something. So we're always, and it goes to what you said earlier, Ade, about self-awareness. For me, the role of the coach requires that I'm continually taking a look at myself. What are my assumptions about the world? What am I taking for granted? What are my blind spots? And, that's a lifelong journey. I don't think I'll ever know the answers to all those things, because life comes along and presents us with new opportunities for learning and discovering something about our own blindness.
Thanks once again. Another thing for us to do, complementary to the first, to really check out the narratives that influence our coachees and ourselves. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
I appreciate it. Who else? What else is cooking inside you as you're listening to these reflections and conversations?
Hello, Aboodi. I'm calling from Ghana.
Hi.
And I've just sent you a text message. It's a question.
Oh, yes. How do I say your name? Itsikata?
Yeah, Innocentia.
Innocentia. Okay, it says Itsikata on the thing, so...
Yes.
Hi, Innocentia.
Itsikata is the last name.
Oh, okay. Hi, Innocentia.
Hi.
So the question is, what are some of the tools that a coach can use to enhance their understanding of the coach's narrative or world? It's a lovely question. It's a really lovely question. And I think I'd say part of this is about tools, but part of it's also about us. So if you like the tools bit, if it is such a thing as a tool, I think is really coming to the conversation with a coachee, being curious to understand what is the coachee's world. So whenever a coachee says something, whatever it is that she or he says, like being curious, where might that come from? What is that statement saying about the person? What often happens in coaching is that we hear a coachee say something, we either go to not necessarily using the words "you are wrong," but if the coachee says, "I have no choice," or "I feel very stuck," we go, "Well, how would you be unstuck?" Or, everybody has a choice, which is totally not to listen to them at all. Or we go to a place of, trying to find solutions. But what about if we went to a different place, which is, I want to be very curious about this human being in front of me. What makes someone say that? And part of that then means that what really is the inner bit of this is I have to be very aware of my own reaction. So when someone says something and I have a reaction to it, I need to notice that reaction, which is the thing around self-awareness that Ade was speaking about. So, this part of coaching development for me, the development of a coach, really has to do with ongoing work on myself, work on my own blind spots, as I was saying, but also really noticing where do I get to react. Because when I get to react to somebody, then often I might not be hearing them anymore. I'm hearing myself reacting. Now, that can be a springboard to a conversation. If I'm working with a coachee and I feel sad when she says something, that might be that there's something to explore around sadness. But I need to really be mindful about myself and my reactions, because sometimes it's just me reacting, going back to my default position. Everybody has a choice, whatever it is. So part of it is self-awareness. The other part of it for me is to be as much as possible a student of life, by which I mean learning about other cultures, learning about other narratives. And it doesn't have to be an academic study, reading books, watching movies. If you watch a sitcom or a movie from a particular country, you'll see narratives at play. If you watch people in an airport, you'll see different people from different narratives moving. And, because I work a lot with somatics, which means working with the body in my coaching, one of the things I might do when I'm in an airport or a railway station is just take a look at people and watch how they move and ask myself questions like, I wonder if this person can ask for what she wants. I wonder if this person has the capacity to say no. If this person was my leader, would I follow her or him? None of this is about being right. It's just about being curious about human beings. And I might ask myself a question like, what is the narrative that person grew up in? I might see someone, walking in a particular way, or I might watch a movie and see someone acting in a particular way, and I start to get curious. What narrative might they live in? What story might they have about the world that makes them say this in this conversation, or makes them act like this? So that thing of then suddenly the whole world becomes a place of curiosity for us, so that we're starting to understand how different people see and experience the world. Literature is great. If you read some literature from a particular country, you'll get something about the values in it. If you read American fiction, for instance, or you read French novels, or you read, a Nigerian story, you'll see something about the culture coming that, particularly in the way that people's emotions and conversations are described. All of this gives us eyes, so that when we come to coaching, we have some curiosity. Oh, I wonder what makes them say that, or I wonder where that comes from. And that, again, is a lifetime's work, really, of building curiosity. So I love to watch movies, for instance, and I also love to read novels. And when I do that, I'm curious. I've been reading some novels by an Egyptian writer, Naguib Mahfouz, reading what he says about kind of life in Cairo in the 1950s. And, it tells me something about the Egyptian culture that makes me curious about the world. And the other thing I want to say about that is not that I'm necessarily going to coach Egyptians, but if I start to see that people in different parts of the world, in different contexts, see and think differently, it just opens my eyes to there's more to life than just the way I see the world. There are other ways. And I think this is a meta point, really, in a sense, because, of course, it's important for us as coaches, but part of the problem I think we have in the world is that we find it very difficult to acknowledge the legitimacy of other perspectives. So when George Bush, during the war in Iraq said, you're with us or against us in the war against terror, of course the point that he was making was political, but it was deeper than that for me. It was a philosophical thing about how we humans are in the world. There's a right way to see the world and a wrong way to see the world. And no coaching can happen if we have that. But more importantly than that, I don't think humans will get out of the messes that we've created for ourselves if we're not able to acknowledge that the way that we are and the certainties that we have about life are only our perspective. They're not the truth. And I see in many different contexts that really, I suppose, the terrible suffering that happens when we start to see that other perspectives are less valued than our own, and then suddenly other people become people that we can eliminate, which we've seen throughout history, the elimination of cultures or tribes, genocide, imprisoning people because they have the wrong, inverted commas, perspectives. So this work that we do as coaches, in a sense, is kind of subversive to that if we keep humble and curious. And, I'm aware that we're getting to the end of this, and it's funny how I end up in this place often when I work with coaches. But I'm remembering I don't know if any of you have seen Steve Jobs' Stanford University speech. It's a beautiful speech in many ways, and I recommend it to you. But there's one bit right at the end where he quotes the whole Earth catalogue, and he says, stay hungry, stay foolish. And I think that is a great philosophy for coaches. Stay hungry, stay foolish. You know, we as soon as we become certain, as soon as we think we know the answer, we've closed the possibility for being curious, for being with our coaches, for changing something profoundly, because we're trying to fit things into a model rather than let me be fresh and here with you and really curious about who you are. And I think if we're able to do that, if we're able to stay hungry, stay foolish, to come with what the Buddhists call beginner's mind, then we have a possibility to create a profession that stays relevant rather than become a set of techniques and answers and formulas. You know, there's a lovely quote from Jung. And he says, learn your theories and techniques as well as you can, and then be prepared to set aside when you meet the miracle of the living soul in front of you. And I think that wisdom of Jung's is really at the heart of making our work matter in the world. Is what is the world that we meet? What is the living soul that we meet in front of us when we're coaching? Not what is our belief or what is our coaching technique, but let me meet you where you are. And that, I think, requires deep, deep work on ourselves. So I'm aware that we have just a few minutes left. Are there any closing questions, or does someone have one more question they'd like to explore? It's very silent, so I don't know if that means...
A question, Aboodi.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so when are you coming to Nigeria to hang out with us and share more on coaching?
Well, I would love to. I mean, I'm very happy to travel. So if there is a possibility to do that, then, I'd be open to that conversation. Or we can do some more stuff by webinars, But, for me, this work, these questions, whether I come to Nigeria or not, is something that I think really fruitful territory for us to explore. And, I know that Nigeria has its challenges, but I don't want to diminish the challenges that Nigeria has, because I do read the news and I see some of the horrible things that have happened and some of the difficulties that people are dealing with there. But I want to go a little bit beyond Nigeria for a moment, because I think these are problems that the world faces. We've had extreme violence in Europe in recent history. We've had extreme violence in other parts of Africa, of course. We've had extreme violence in the Middle East. We've had extreme injustice all over the world. We've had, extreme racial prejudice all over the world. So for me, these are global problems that we human beings seem unable to have dealt with. However we talk about it. One of the things that happens, and, our British Prime Minister, to my embarrassment, I must say, talked about, I think Nigeria is one of the countries, and was it Afghanistan the other, the fantastically corrupt countries. And I thought, well, hang on a minute. We are not immune to corruption in Britain. People have made a lot of money out of being corrupt. So these are global problems that whatever, stage we are, or whichever part of the world we are, we haven't got this right. It's not that anybody has the answers to this. And I think we humans are all a little bit lost. And what we do with that lostness is to blame each other and say, well, of course, they're corrupt, or they're extremists, or they're this, or they're that. And we don't have any capacity for looking at our part in things. And we become certain about our rightness. And, let me just end with this. On the gates of one of the concentration camps was a statement that said, we never want to be as certain as the people who built this place. And I think it's that certainty about our rightness that causes us so much suffering in the world, for all of the reasons that we've been speaking about. And I can get very evangelical about this because it matters deeply to me. But I think that is part of what his coaching is about, is how do we begin to unpick the certainty of ourselves so that we can help coachees unpick that certainty. And maybe we have a chance to do something about the world in which we find ourselves. And in essential, I see your question. Let me type the answer to that so that I don't overlook it. So I'm going to end by saying what I said before, which is, our work for me is to stay hungry, stay foolish. Let's always be curious. And Einstein said, I have no particular skill. I'm merely passionately curious. And I love that as a mood for coaching. I care passionately about my coachees, but I'm also deeply curious. I don't have the answer. Let's just explore together. So I want to thank you so much for the conversation, for inviting me to be part of this. I hope that it's been helpful, and I would love to, explore further conversations with you. And I wish you a great rest of the day. And I will take care of your question in Sentia, but I want to say thank you to all of you for organizing it, for navigating the challenges of technology, and I wish you all a great rest of the day and great coaching future, because there's work to be done and we must all do it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Aboodi, for what I can say is a very thought-provoking presentation. I think for us in Nigeria, and I think part of other parts of Africa, where people also have that same narrative of, it is well by God's grace, everything, it's something that is essential for us as coaches to think about our own coaching presence and the buttons and assumptions that we also carry into the coaching conversation. And, it's something that definitely I would like to continue the conversation on. I acknowledge Ade's suggestion that we continue this conversation, and maybe as coaches we should get together and talk about this more and explore how this impacts us as an industry locally. And that just leaves me to thank you, Aboodi, for a lovely.
Thank you.
It was extremely insightful and gives us a lot to think about and to delve into, to continue to peel. And I love what you said, that the quote by Einstein, that have no particular skill, because I think sometimes as coaches we all look for tools and how they approach the methodology, but I'm only passionately curious. That was very powerful for me, and I just hope that we all stay passionately curious as coaches. And happy International Coaching Week, everybody. Thank you for joining in. I hope it was worth it for you, and we hope to give you more of these webinars, technology permitting. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you on Friday.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Bye for now.
All right. Bye-bye.